It was many years ago. I don't recall the exact year, but I was around 10 or 11. It was Christmas Day and everyone was home as usual. Friends or relatives came to visit sometimes, but not usually. On this day, a friend of one of my sisters who lived outside the country was in the country, so he came around. He was an amiable man who stuttered in his speech. We'll call him Al. A friend of my siblings who came around the house usually always got into conversation with everyone seated in the living room, and that was where most of us were. I am much younger than my siblings, but the discussion was not the kind that would be scandalous for a child like me. We had laughs and a great conversation. I say we, but I was the only one not talking. A little while later, he wondered why we didn't go anywhere and if we didn't have anyone or anywhere to visit. He was in the mood to take us for a ride in his car as there was no traffic on the highway as there usually was all year, and many people had left the state for their indigenous states for the holiday. We had a cousin who was in the military, but he lived quite a distance away. But since the roads were free, he offered to take us to visit. I was excited to hop on a free ride, so he took us and we went. I was excited. The road was free and there was no traffic. I usually stayed home to watch television all day on Christmas, but leaving the house for a change was a good choice. When we arrived at my cousin's house, he wasn't home and neither was his wife, but we met members of his church at his house. It was the same situation at my house when a guest came to visit. The difference in this case was that the guests were the only ones in the living room and the owners of the house weren't home except for their children, who were a little younger than I was. Unlike my situation, they were not in the living room. They were probably sent to their rooms, so they weren't present when the adults were discussing. The guests were talking and enjoying one another's company, but talking about their version of Christianity. Now, my cousin wasn't and still isn't Catholic. He belongs to one out of the thousands of Pentecostal churches in Lagos, and these people were from his church. I was not pleased that our cousin was not home, and I was not interested in sitting around for their conversation, with good reason. Many Pentecostals have the once saved, always saved belief, and the belief that anyone who did not belong to their group or believed how they did was going to hell. I had never known this about Pentecostals until that moment in my cousin's house. It almost messed up Christmas for me because these people went on about their beliefs about Jesus and the fate of Christians in the afterlife, and then went on, to my surprise, to condemn all Muslims to hell because they do not believe Jesus is the Messiah. I had never heard anyone say this before, and from the little I understood about my Catholic faith, I knew it was wrong for anyone to judge another soul to hell, as only God had the right to judge souls, for all had sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. I also knew that Jesus warned against judging others, for only God sees the heart and decides who truly believes in him and follows him, for man cannot see as God sees. So to hear these adults say what they said shocked me based on my stated understanding. I grew uncomfortable because I also knew that Pentecostals hate Catholics as well and spoke badly about us. Still, I never heard them say anything about Muslims, and I felt awkward because Al was Muslim and had come visit him from a predominantly Muslim country. I'm sure my siblings like me would have wanted to leave earlier, but they chose to wait a little longer for my cousin to return. They realized that this was a mistake as Al's religion eventually got attacked when we had barely been there 15 minutes. We were compelled to stay because Al had to go into defense mode to defend his faith. This was when I realized that he had a stutter in his speech. I never really noticed it earlier while he was talking until that moment. When a person who stutters gets triggered, he stutters even more when he needs to speak. And arguments broke out, and these Pentecostals did not back down. I do not remember the details of the exchange because all I had in mind was when we would leave before they found out that we were Catholics and the argument escalated. So much for a great Christmas. It went from jolly to grinchy. When I look back on this incident, I see missed opportunities on the part of the Pentecostals. If I were an atheist child, I would have become Muslim if I had walked into that argument. This is because the only person who acted in charity and generosity that Christmas Day was the Muslim man, Al. The Pentecostals oozed self-righteousness, judgment, lack of charity, pride, and arrogance, with nothing about their attitude resembling that of Christ. The Muslim acted closer to how Christ would have acted in my mind compared to how I perceived the Pentecostals that day. But anyway, I did not believe in Islam, and neither was I drawn to it. So that wouldn't have happened with this encounter. I was already a strong little Catholic. Before age 8, I was convinced that the Catholic faith was true. I could not imagine being any other kind of Christian. This was not because I was born into Catholicism. It was because of the demeanor of other Christians relative to the Catholics around me. And the encounter at my cousin's place made me embrace my Catholic faith even more, because despite the fact I already didn't believe in Islam, I did not at any time feel that talking about Jesus involved damning any soul to hell by my judgment. After all, Jesus never came across like that. He spoke the truth. The truth he spoke could be very uncomfortable to accept, but as uncomfortable as it got, it always presented hope and not damnation. The sense of damnation only came from choosing not to follow him before your time on earth was up. But these people acted the opposite of how I understood Jesus as a child. Unfortunately, I was too little to defend Christianity from how these Pentecostals had misrepresented it. I would only hope that their fellow church members were not as disastrous as they were, but I could doubt it. I never got to probe Al's mind, but I would have to wonder if he also felt that that was what we Catholics taught. If he encountered another Christian, if this was his first root shock, would he be open to hearing about Jesus and coming to the truth? That day was the last time I saw Al. He had returned to the Muslim country where he was working in the Middle East. He would probably reinforce his beliefs in Islam after returning to the Muslim country he worked in, where the national religion is Islam. However, I don't know if he is still Muslim. Still, if the Pentecostals we encountered at my cousin's home were more Christ-like, that day would have been an opportunity to sow a seed in Al's heart about how living for Christ and accepting him in his life would transform his life on many levels. He was comfortable in my house for some reason. He knew we were Catholic Christians and that we did not believe in Islam, but he still loved to visit. He felt he was among family with us, even to the point of taking us on that long trip. If the Christians he encountered were Christ-like after that long trip, I would leave it to imagine what his encounter would have done for him these many years later. I can only wonder if his heart had a wall built around it that day, and if he has encountered real Christians who will get through those walls. Otherwise, we must pray that the Holy Spirit already got through to him. Suppose you are like these people I have spoken about. In that case, I urge you to consider how Jesus disapproved of the Pharisees. How terrible for you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give to God a tenth even of the seasoning herbs, such as mint, dill, and cumin, but you neglect to obey the really important teachings of the law, such as justice and mercy and honesty. These you should practice without neglecting the others. Blind guides, you strain a fly out of your drink, but swallow a camel. Please read all of Matthew chapter 23 from verse 1 to verse 36. You will realize how in different ways, the way these guests, rather than heartily condemn the Muslims to hell with their lack of charity and compassion, should have pondered their shortcomings and need to be more open to God's grace working in their lives and the mercy of God on all and their parts to play in all of it. Consider also when he spoke about prostitutes and tax collectors making their way into the kingdom of heaven before the Pharisees. The tax collectors and prostitutes heard Jesus, believed him, and changed their lives, while the Pharisees behaved oppositely. The Pentecostals were in danger of thinking they had nothing more to do in maintaining salvation. Yet, all Al had to do was hear about Jesus from them, or be finally converted from a combination of his dealings with my family and what they had to say and come to Christ. Yet, they probably got in the way with their egos, making it about themselves and condemning our soul, when we all have yet to face our judgment by Christ, the only judge. Judgments we will only face after we die, but that is when our trials end, and it will be clear who remained faithful to God and who didn't, who returned to God and who turned away, and who Jesus has counted worthy to live with him forever, and who he counted unworthy. No Christian has this authority, not even the church, only Jesus Christ. Consider also how Christ interacted with tax collectors and prostitutes and all sorts of sinners. He ate with them and made them feel comfortable around him. They got so drawn to him with how he related with them that it tugged on their hearts to change their lives. Otherwise, he could have acted like the Pharisees and caused them to remain in their lifestyle. If we are followers of Christ, we must yield the same impact that he had on non-believers and not act like the Pharisees and yield their results. Don't be arrogant and think you are better than non-Christians. They have not yet died. It is your responsibility to bring Christ to them before the end of their lives, not stand in the way of Christ getting to them while they are still alive and have a chance.